Good to have everybody here. Where are we missing Terry today, Jim?
Yeah, it should be right here.
Okay. All right. And
Oh, she's hollering me that she has a question. So, but she got to be here to ask it. So don't worry about it right now.
okay. And I wasn't worried that she didn't have a question either. I knew she'd have a question.
Did you hear that, Terry? David said he wasn't worried that you would have a question. He knew you would.
Okay. Well, so we continue the adventures. We're just about to go back to Jerusalem again after this foray into the Macedonia and Greece and other such places. And the focus today perhaps is on Corinth, but also what happens in other places. Tara, do you want to lead with your question? Or do you want to wait for us to read that section? But now you're muted.
Okay, so I should have maybe emailed you my question. The term taglum, T-A-G-L-U-M, I believe it's spelled. What is that? What does that refer to? You have mentioned the Mishnah and the Talmud. What's a taglum?
Did I mention?
No, it's come up
well,
in some other things.
Oh, so I think you mean the word Targum.
Targum, yes. Okay, sorry.
Targum means translation. And very often when people say, Targum in general in Hebrew is used as translation. But in Rabbinic Hebrew, almost always the Targum, which is being referred to as Aramaic. And there are various translations in Aramaic from, certainly as early as 2,000 years ago. We don't have manuscripts of texts we can say they're at least 2,000 years old. They're younger than that, but and there's different types. There's some that are rather word for word. The classical Targum of the Torah would be Onkelos, the 5 books of Moses, and that's a Babylonian Aramaic Targum. There are various Targumim that are sometimes labeled Jerusalem Targum, which means they're from the land of Israel, not necessarily from Jerusalem. There's a famous Targum, and most of them are of the Torah, of the 5 books of Moses, because that was read publicly. Because the people no longer knew Hebrew in Jesus' time, for instance, somebody was standing next to the Torah reader, giving the Aramaic translation. Today, we would just look in a book, right? If you go to a synagogue, they're reading in Hebrew, they follow with English. Although I was at a synagogue in LA last week where they chanted much of the prophetic passage, they just chanted it in English. Correct. Some of those Targumim though are not literal. They're embellished. They're embellished Targums, very much so that if you may have, say, 6 or 7 words in the verse in Hebrew, suddenly there's 27 words in the Aramaic because it goes on to explain a lot more.
So it's a translation, a version, but maybe in interpretation with it.
Well, any translation, of course, is an interpretation.
Okay, yeah,
but some interpretations are more literal than others. Some are embellished. And then finally, Targum really, as a phenomenon, refers to what we call the Septuagint as well in the Greek-speaking world. So the Septuagint, or there's a famous, there's another a Greek translation that's called Aquilas's, apropos our chapter today, Aquilas's translation. Some of them we have remnants of, some we don't. They're just referred to in other literature. And also in the Greek translations, you have those that are more literal than others. And then you have Syriac, which is a form of Aramaic, but it's that's used in the Eastern Orthodox Church. That gives us the Pshita version of the Torah. So there's a lot. The Targum world is very, very wide, and Targum studies became popular kind of only in the 80s. Kind of flourished. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Anything else? Okay. Steve, you want to put us into context, into New Testament or into Lukean context for our chapter today?
Yeah, good. Yeah, thanks. So we're in the context of Paul's so-called second missionary journey, which is essentially a period between, let's say, 50 to 52 Common Era. It's just a 2-year stint that he leaves Antioch without Barnabas. They kind of split over John Mark. He goes through the Galatian provinces. Then he receives this vision that Macedonia needs help. They go over to Macedonia, Europe, and he visits Thessalonica, Berea, Philippi, and then on down to Athens, which we heard last week. And then he leaves Athens after being relatively disappointed, right? I mean, he didn't get a lot of traction, but he had some dialogue, had some interaction with the Greeks in Achaia, where Athens and Corinth are, the province of Achaia. And so now he goes to Corinth, where he will stay for about 18 months. And then as David said, he ends up going down. He leaves Corinth and goes over to Ephesus, and then down to Caesarea, to Jerusalem, back to Antioch. So this is all happening in a 2-year period. As I said last week at the very end, when he arrives in Corinth, he receives word from Timothy and Silas, whom he had left in Macedonia, and they bring news to Paul of some conflict in Thessalonica, where he has just been and founded a church there. And so Timothy and Silas give that report. He writes his very first letter that we have in the scriptures, 1 Thessalonians. And then also he hears, and then I think the implication is that the church at Philippi gives money to Timothy and Silas to bring to Paul. And when he gets the money, he stops making tents with Priscilla and Aquila, which we'll soon see, to devote himself more full time to building this church in Corinth, and for that 18-month period. So I think that's all I would say for now. And just one last thing is that, remember, for Luke, who's the author of Luke and Acts, I think the overarching point is that the community of Luke that gives us this text in its final form are trying to make a case that the Christian church, the Christianity as it came to be called, is the legitimate heir to Judaism, that it's the fulfillment of the law and the prophets, and yet it means to be an intra-Jewish movement within Judaism. See, so that's why we have all these layers, and we'll see again today that the resistance that he meets causes him to outburst, I'm going to just go to the Gentiles, because this intra-Jewish conflict over questions of law, over politics, all the usual suspects, it forces Paul to say, I'm going to focus now on the Gentiles. It doesn't in no way, shape, or form suggest that that's a universal statement, that now we leave Judaism to go to Gentiles. That happens to Paul in some specific places, but it's not to be generalized as a total forgetting of his tradition. He's just adapting and making it up as he goes, as he believes the Spirit inspires. Okay.
Okay, thank you. Harold, you want to read the first section for us from 18 to 4, from 1 to 4?
Yeah. Oops. You said 1 to 4. I've got,
It says 18, but it
it
means
says
chapter.
18, okay. After this, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. There he found a Jew named Aquila from Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had ordered all Jews to leave Rome. Paul went to see them, and because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them and they worked together. By trade, they were tent makers. Every Sabbath, he would argue in the synagogue and would try to convince Jews and Greeks.
Okay, so you said before, I said, Steve, in some places, like in Athens, he didn't get great traction. Well, there's this spectrum of getting really good traction and getting stones thrown at you, getting your tuchus beaten, right? It's like, it's somewhere in between. So this is another one of those episodes of, we're told he's gone to the synagogue, trying to convince, in this time, Jews and Greeks as well. But then we get this detail, which is like, why? What do we care? About his trade and the fact that we're tent makers. Does anybody have? I have some ideas that I brought from Jewish sources, but
I have a question.
sure.
I have always thought that Paul was somehow associated with the temple in Jerusalem, and that was what he did. This is the first time I'm hearing that Paul was a tent maker. Is
Right.
this appears somewhere else, or is this the first and only time?
Steve, you'll correct me, but I think this is the only time that it talks about his trade, correct?
Well, no, like in Thessalonians, for example, he says, look, I never asked you for anything. I worked every day, So, and here the implication is that it's on Shabbat that he's able to go to the synagogue, but he's working during the week until that next paragraph, when Silas and Timothy arrive. That's when he's able to devote himself more fully. But there's implications in his letters, like he took money from the Philippians, but he didn't take it from the Thessalonians. He didn't take it from the Corinthians either, as we'll see in his letter to Corinth, 1st and 2nd Corinthians. That becomes an issue. Some accuse him of being a freeloader, and he makes the case, no way, I worked, and I worked, and I had other means. I didn't pull from y'all.
Right.
So
That has to do with his being a tradesperson, working.
Yeah.
Maybe
Yeah.
flip the page, everybody, and look. I brought from Pauline letters, 2 examples. One of them you quoted already, that emphasize, a weary, second line, from the work of our own hands. And it's not the work of spreading the word. It's work of a trade, or as you said, you remember our labor and toil, and so that we would not burden any of you with it. The 2 sources that came to mind for me was Shemaiah, who's 1st century BCE, used to say, love work, hate acting the superior, which in Hebrew is really interesting. It says tisnet rabbanut. Rabbanut also means rabbinate, but it means being a master, feeling superior, and do not attempt to draw near to the ruling authority. Right? Don't try to rub elbows with the big boys, but love work. And then the classical section from the Talmud is the following, number 4. A father is obligated with regard to his son to circumcise him. Apropos our talking. By the way, this is the context of who has responsibility, the father or the mother, or for what issues. So the father to circumcise him, to redeem him, that is if he gets taken captive by the authorities or by non-Jews, to teach him Torah, and to marry him to a woman, and to teach him a trade. And then some later add, he must also teach him to swim. And we fast forward to the 2nd century CE, Rabbi Yehuda says, any father who does not teach his son a trade teaches him banditry. Can it enter your mind, ask the editor of the Talmud, really banditry? It's that bad? So they come back, well, it's as if he taught him banditry. In other words, the point is, get yourself a profession. And so that's very much couched in the Jewish tradition here. The question is, why does the detail that he's a tent maker come here? And there were other translations over the years as well, having to do with a leather worker. But I think the consensus today is having to do with making tents. I don't know, did anybody, did it strike anybody as what it would have meant literally? Yeah, Don.
Yeah, I have a footnote in my Bible, my study Bible. It said all young rabbinical students had to learn a trade. And tent makers were really leather workers. This province from where Paul came was noted for its cloth made from goat's hair. It is likely that Paul's skill involved making such cloth.
Yeah, the reason it says that is because the word in Greek, it corresponds to the Septuagint translation of parts of the altar, of the tabernacle in the desert. And hence there people made that connection between maybe this is something like he's a person who builds the temple. Maybe this is where you got what you were thinking, the background of your question, Ajit. That has something to do with it. The truth is, we don't know. This particular profession is not mentioned of the 15 or 20 or so professions that are given to different rabbis. Maybe it's 15 spanning over a 300-year period. I didn't find tent maker anywhere. There's one who's a leather worker, but I think it has to do with the fact that he stayed with them because they were from the same guild. Right, they were from the same. They were in the same business. It's hard for us to imagine today. You go to another city and you stay with the insurance salesman. If you're an insurance salesman, you stay with a realtor. I don't know. But then, of course, it is in the context of here because you do your profession for 6 days a week and then you rest on the Sabbath. For him, you might say it's not resting if he goes to synagogue and tries to convince Jews and Greeks, but you could say that about every rabbi as well, who rarely rests on the Sabbath. Any other comments or questions? Yes, Rita Claire.
I wondered, could that being a tent maker have anything at all to do with the fact that they lived in tents and going through the desert after they escaped from Egypt?
Maybe perhaps it's symbolic of the wandering. Maybe it's a very, very nuanced way of hinting at the fact that Paul and his people, they were wandering, that's their 40 years of wandering in the desert. Perhaps something like that. That'd be a lovely idea. I don't know if that would be the simple meaning of the text, but it's certainly a lovely, lovely idea.
Okay.
It's an interesting comment that there he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, another positive mention of a woman, because Claudius, the emperor, had ordered all Jews to leave Rome. And there are a few extra biblical sources, like Suetonius mentions at the instigation of Chrestus, Chrestus. Scholars assume Christ, right, Messiah, at the instant, which fits with what we've been saying in this study, that these intra-Jewish tensions between the Jewish Christians and the Jewish Christian circumcisers and the different levels create conflict, and the emperor in Rome sees something going on, assumes it's an inter-Jewish squabble, and expels them. He dies in, I think, 55, 54, and presumably they could return at that point. But I just think it's a fascinating, interesting tidbit for this ancient culture to have that, and that's where they connect.
There's an alternative way of understanding this passage as well. That Chrestus is actually the name of somebody and not Christus. And it's one more person who claims to be a Messiah, one more person who's out there. When what I think both of the interpretations are important for us to think about. First of all, the context of everything we've been going through in this unrest, this spiritual, it's called the spiritual, cultural, spiritual unrest that's in the Roman Empire, but also the other interpretation allows us to once again remember something that we're going to be reminded of in this chapter itself, that this is only one story of how Christianity grew, or a different type of Judaism than rabbinic Judaism. right? We're going to have another example at the end of the chapter about a kind of an alternative school of Christianity. That seems to be a polemic here. There was a lot of stuff going on out there, and not necessarily Paul's stuff, but maybe another false messiah stuff. And we know from other literature that there were plenty. As I heard somebody say, the rabbi at the synagogue I went to on Saturday says, you couldn't walk 2 meters without meeting a Messiah in Jerusalem, something like that. You know, some kind of, okay, a dime a dozen, whatever he said. All right. Should we go on? Ajit, would you like to read 5 onward?
Yeah. When Silas and Timothy arrived from Macedonia, Paul was occupied with proclaiming the word, testifying to the Jews that the Messiah was Jesus. When they opposed and reviled him, in protest, he shook the dust from his clothes and said to them, "Your blood be on your heads. I am innocent. From now on, I will go to the Gentiles." Then he left the synagogue and went to the house of a man named Titus Justus, a worshiper of God. His house was next door to the synagogue. Crispus, the official of the synagogue, became a believer in the Lord, together with all his household, and many of the Corinthians who heard Paul became believers and were baptized. One night the Lord said to Paul in a vision, "Do not be afraid, but speak and do not be silent, for I am with you, and no one will lay a hand on you to harm you, for there are many in the city who are my people." He stayed there 1 year and 6 months, teaching the word of God among them.
Okay. Reactions, feelings. Yes, Don.
Just a lot going on here.
Yeah.
Yes, Harold.
Basically, when I see this paragraph, as well as some of the material from the last session, the message I'm hearing is that the only good Jew is the one who converts. As I see here in this paragraph, you have the bad Jews are the ones who oppose Paul. It's like, why do they oppose him? Why do they revile him so much? Well, for all we know, this is one perspective. For all we know, Paul may have gone waltzing into their synagogue saying, "You guys are doing it all wrong," and being very obstinate and obnoxious and opinionated and stuff like this. And who knows? We have no idea what they were reacting to because we weren't there. But they oppose him and they disagree with him, and he becomes enraged. And the message but you have over in the other, and many of the Corinthians heard Paul and became believers and were baptized. Those are the good guys. So the message I'm hearing is very much of bad guys here, good guys here. The good Jew will be the one who converts. And perhaps I'm more sensitive to this because I've encountered this personally. Oh, synagogue? What's a synagogue? I was asked one time, and I said, "Oh, it's a Jewish place of worship." "Oh, that's a real shame because you don't accept Christ."
Mm-hmm.
So same kind of thing as in 2,000 years ago. "Oh, you can't become a Christian unless you're circumcised." So the male Gentiles eventually were relieved to hear that they didn't have to become circumcised after all. Just as I'm relieved today that I don't have to believe in Jesus to have a relationship with God.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Harold. Eileen, did you want to say something? No, okay.
I have a question about the comment, "Your blood be on your heads, I am innocent." What exactly does that sentence mean?
It's a widespread use in the Hebrew Bible, and it means, yeah, you take responsibility for the bad thing that's about to happen now, whether it's actual death or it came to mean all sorts of bad things. And it's used in Matthew as well, you may remember, in a number of places. So it's in other words, I've tried, but I give up, kind of a thing. Now it's your responsibility. But I want to get back to Harold's comment. If people were wondering why we're doing this course, this was like a prime example of when usually it seems that we're content with exchanging ideas of each other's backgrounds and beliefs, but sometimes there are some painful issues that need to be lifted up, and this is one of them. It's come up in other places as well. It's been in the background of what we've been studying now. So maybe we should just spend a few more moments on this particular issue. If somebody would like to respond perhaps to Harold or to, yes, Richard.
I was just going to say that I ditto Harold. Of course, I've had the same experiences he's had in numerous times. And of course, I have a partner who's goes to an evangelical, fundamentalist church for some strange reason I don't understand. But I've gone with him, and I've had that same type of encounter. So, I mean, for what it's worth, I mean, it's that there are Christians out there who have this very condescending attitude of I'm saved and I'm going to heaven and you're going to hell. My first experience in that I've had it many times since, but was when I went into the military. I went to as a young officer. I went to Fort Gordon, Georgia, which is outside of Augusta, and that would have been in 1968 when the South was still the old South, and I had a very negative experience on base where some missionaries, I guess that's what you call them, came to my officer's billet, and I even went to the commanding officer and complained that they had, I was being harassed. And they had gotten private information about my religious beliefs from a card they kept on, in case you, as a soldier, in case you died, they wanted to know, they go to this box and they find out how your body is to be, taken care of, what religious requirements are. And so that was the only place that was their information saying that I was Jewish. And so anyway, I don't want to get involved in a long story about this, but that happened to me. That was my first experience with this type of attitude.
Don?
Yeah, a couple of things. I think there's a lot of ignorance on the part of Gentiles in connection with what has been said. There's a lot of influence of the ecclesial church that has, in a sense, widened this. But in response, theologically, and no offense is meant, but Christians may feel they are free from the burdens of the number of laws and rituals of the Hebrew religion in their faith in Christ. So there is a flip side to what Harold and what Richard have said in another tradition. Does that make sense? I hope.
Yeah. On the other hand, I'm reading a quote from Adolf Hitler that says he was not a Catholic, but a German Christian. So has continued to be some impact of that anti-Jewish viewpoint. And I think I'm glad we're here, we're talking about this so we can understand that this was written and how do we move forward from here and how do we resolve our differences, if you will, because frankly, the Jewish Christians need a dialogue. The Jews and the Christians need a dialogue to understand each other and get past it, because I feel there's still a lot of I'm not Jewish, But I'm saying there's anti-Semitism in our country today, and it seems to be increasing. So we have to be able to talk about these things. So I'm glad you brought it up, Harold.
Yeah, I am too.
Well,
Carrie? Yeah.
And having grown up in a religious household, but that was very Catholic, I mean, I was told that all Protestants go to hell because they're not Catholics. They're not members of the one true church. You know, I mean, and I grew up with that until I met a whole lot of Protestants in high school who were wonderful people, and I began to question that. I mean, but you know, we're taught that whatever you learn as a child is very hard to unlearn. And, you know, so for me, God just keeps getting bigger and bigger. Right now, we're doing a great courses thing on Gnosticism. And what's very fascinating is all the versions of Christianity that were out there until they were declared heresies. But I mean, we're into like the 300s now and learning about versions, you might say versions of Christianity that were quite acceptable. And some of those early people that were considered church fathers and had really good ideas were later declared heretics in later centuries because of their beliefs. So, you know, I mean, it's like and you can tell that. I mean, here, Paul, and they're trying to figure it out. And it took people a long, long time to figure it out.
Yeah, just one other thought. I think in Christianity, there's a movement away from a cross theology to a table theology. More of a unification, not much of the fire and brimstone and hell that was prevalent perhaps in the 50s. But I think that these discussions are valuable. I mean, we both have the same book. I went through this little study period with Joel with our last session, and I was upset when I learned that the tradition, that the Christian translation of a section of Joel changed the chapter and verse markings. That upset me as a Christian. And that just is the influence I tried to demonstrate in a perhaps a minor manner how the ecclesial church has got their hands on this and screwed it up a little bit.
So I want to take everybody perhaps back from the 20th century and back 2,000 years to when this text was written, right? And the foundational role that the book of Acts plays in Christianity and this particular narrative. And what I think what is most important is to hear the experiences of how this sounds when we actually look at the text itself, the way Harold began. Of course, it's fueled by life experience that many people have had, but it really doesn't help to say, to my mind, well, that's one part of the church, the other part of the church. The text, this is what the text sounds like to Jewish ears, and not just now, but certainly over the centuries as well. And that's something for us to, I think, keep in mind. That's why we're studying together. That being said, there are lots of texts, Jewish texts, and certainly Muslim texts, and I would imagine Hindu texts, maybe not Baha'i texts, but other texts that are very that are not tolerant of other Jews, of other traditions, right? They're intolerant. And we have them in Judaism, we have them in the Hebrew Bible itself as well. I guess the difference is that there weren't governments around the world throughout history that were motivated by these kinds of texts. And that's maybe which changes who has these texts. Anyway, should we move ahead, or is there, Steve, did you want to respond to any of this?
No, but I'm grateful for the conversation, and I do think it's complicated, and that by the time Luke was written, the Christian church was already kind of calcifying as a Gentile movement. And the Jewish rabbinic movement that moved to the Mediterranean coast eventually, there was lots of polarizing. The Jewish community was zealously guarding its tradition over and against the Christian interlopers, and actually had some condemnations of Christians. And a lot of this is wound up not only in just legal or theological issues, but in political strife in relation to the Romans. They're the empire that's over everybody. So I just think it's lovely that we are all together talking about this. I think it's a tragedy. I think many of Paul's letters that are written before the book of Acts, right? The book of Acts is a whole generation after Paul. We got to remember that piece too. And Luke is kind of again giving us a big view of this movement that was intended to be an intra-Jewish movement. And Luke at many points argues that they were pushed out by the Jewish community, but by Jewish community, I'm saying 9 times out of 10, it wasn't the Jews per se, it was the Judaizers, the zealous Jews insisting on aspects of the law. It's great to believe in a Messiah, and yes, there were many messianic movements, but when you talk about Jesus as Messiah, anyway, I just think in many of Paul's letters, it's a whole different picture, a whole different tone, and that Paul himself was not trying to convert Jews per se. He believed Jews already had the covenant. He was at his best trying to bring the outsiders into the koinonia that Jews already enjoyed. And he thought that access through Jesus was the way in. And so that raises the question of Jesus as Messiah and Jesus as the one who was raised from death. Those two things become the fulcrum that a lot of this debate, gets thrown. So I think we should just keep reading to the end, David, and then because I think it opens up a little bit more as we go.
Okay. So Ajit, we'll get back to you afterwards. Is that all right? Okay. Steve Byrne, would you like to read?
Sure. We're starting in 12, right?
Correct. Yeah.
Okay. But when Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews made a united attack on Paul and brought him before the tribunal. They said, "This man is persuading people to worship God in ways that are contrary to the law." Just as Paul was about to speak, Gallio said to the Jews, "If it were a matter of crime or serious villainy, I would be justified in accepting the complaint of you Jews. But since it is a matter of questions about words and names in your own law, see to it yourselves. I do not wish to be a judge of these matters." And he dismissed them from the tribunal. Then all of them seized Sosthenes, the official of the synagogue, and beat him in front of the tribunal. But Gallio paid no attention to any of these things.
Ajit, did you have a comment?
No, but I'm going back to the very idea of the expectation of the Messiah that the Jews had, that he would be the Redeemer. And redemption probably meant that he would drive out the Romans. And there was I'm sure they had difficulty accepting Jesus because Jesus hadn't accomplished what they thought the Messiah would accomplish. But why did this verse 17, then all of them seized Sosthenes, the official of the synagogue, and beat him in front of the tribunal? That seems like a non sequitur somehow. How does that fit into this paragraph? I'm not sure. They're talking about Paul and suddenly they're beating up this guy.
Steve?
Well, I mean, after that rejection, your blood be on your own heads. I am innocent from now on. I will go to the Gentiles. And that same phrase is about 4 or 5 times in the book of Acts, depending on the context. And then he left the synagogue and went to the house of Titus, who was a God-fearer. That's that 4th row of the synagogue we keep talking about. A phubemenoi, one who had reverence for the Jewish God, but didn't want to become Jewish. Well, he says, will y'all come into my house? This message of grace that Paul is speaking, that already Messiah has come and is giving us forgiveness and grace and inviting us to be part of the covenant people. That's good news. He would say, come into my home. Well, then Crispus, the official of the synagogue, who's next door, he's been persuaded. He comes along and is baptized. Paul is given that confidence. Don't be afraid, Paul. You're on the right course. He's validated. But then Gallio, who's the Roman proconsul in charge of that province, he clearly perceives this as an intra-Jewish problem. He doesn't see Gentiles and Jews. He doesn't, from the outside in, he just thinks this is a Jewish issue. And Paul, and I think others, thought it was too. But at that point, they just seems, it seems like Ajit, they're just kind of ganging up on Sosthenes. They find him and just use him as a placeholder for Paul and beat him up because they're pushing back against Paul's challenge to everything they hold near and dear, their tradition. And so Paul has rattled this cage. So I think just it spills over onto Sosthenes. That's all I can say.
Yeah, I understand in the context of a lynching, Ajit, where sometimes it's a frustration with a particular group. They demonstrate something, then they find something, a placeholder, as Steve said, or I would say a scapegoat. And that particular person. By the way, we've had these officials in synagogues. The word that comes up here quite a bit is arche synagoges, which is on an inscription outside of about a few hundred meters from the temple, a synagogue that existed at the same time as the temple, and it was dedicated by the son of the son of the son. It was a 3-generational arche synagoges. What I used to say, the president of the shul dedicated that synagogue for the Torah to be read and studied therein, not for prayer. Yes, Terry.
All right, and I wondered about this too, Ajit, when I was reading. I thought, wait a minute, why suddenly beat up on Sosthenes? But, in terms of the placement of this, Paul said, your blood be upon your own heads, I'm innocent. I wonder if it's a reference back to that he kind of, said, okay, whatever happens to you, that's your fault because I'm innocent. And there's this mention here that this guy gets beat up. It just struck me as maybe that's like justification for what he said, and suddenly it's happening.
No, I was confused by the fact that they had Paul, and whatever his name is, said you're free to go. Paul is there, and they beat this other guy up. That didn't make any sense to me.
Well, puzzled me too.
Okay, Terry, you want to read going forward?
Sure.
Verse 18.
All right. After staying there for a considerable time, Paul said farewell to the brothers and sisters and sailed for Syria, accompanied by Priscilla and Aquila. At Centracia, he had his hair cut, for he was under a vow. When they reached Ephesus, he left them there, but first he himself went into the synagogue and had a discussion with the Jews. When they asked him to stay longer, he declined, but on taking leave of them, he said, I will return to you if God wills. Or maybe he said, I must at all costs keep the approaching festival in Jerusalem, but I will return to you if God wills. Then he set sail from Ephesus.
Right, maybe just read to the end of the
Sure.
section.
When he had landed at Caesarea, he went up to Jerusalem and greeted the church, and then went down to Antioch. After spending some time there, he departed and went from place to place throughout the region of Galatia and Phrygia, strengthening all the disciples.
Okay, so that business with the italics and that is in another manuscriptural tradition. So it may be the shorter text, maybe the longer text. I don't know that that's all that important, other than perhaps I would favor the shorter text, because I don't think he necessarily went up for a festival in Jerusalem. We don't need him to go for a festival. What we do need him to go is because of this vow he took and the hair cutting. Are people familiar with what's going on here?
No.
Yeah.
Anybody?
Yeah,
Go ahead, Don.
I think it's a Nazarite vow.
Yeah.
That
Right.
we're talking about here.
So what can you tell us about the Nazarite vow?
Well,
If anything.
Samuel, I think, took a Nazarite vow. His mother brought him to the temple, made clothes for him, delivered them. You had Samson was a Nazarite. There was John the Baptist was a Nazarite. There are a couple of more, and they escape me right now.
So in the case of Samson and Samuel, they're actually problematic examples because they didn't take the vow. Their mothers took the vow for them, or God imposed the vow upon the parents, right?
It was a vicarious vow.
Right. So in rabbinic literature, they have a problem with Samson, and especially Samson, because he certainly didn't act in the way that you're supposed to act when you have done the vow. And they discern between a Nazarite from birth and a Nazarite vow. And what's talked about in Numbers, if you flip the page for a second, from Numbers 6 to 5, this is just that whole chapter deals with the Nazarite vow. Throughout the term of his vow, and it, by the way, it can also be a woman, no razor shall touch their head. They shall remain consecrated until the completion of the term of the Nazarite of the Lord, Ladonai, and the hair of their head being left to grow untrimmed. And then they have to bring, after they finished it, and they do cut their hair, then they have to bring a sacrifice. Now, you can't bring a sacrifice in the first century, the first part of the first century, you can't bring a sacrifice other than in Jerusalem. So it seems to me that the reason that he's going up to Jerusalem is because he's fulfilled whatever the vow is a time, a certain set of time. For the typical one was 30 days, we're told. And there's an entire tractate of the Talmud which is devoted to the Nazarite vows. So unlike Samuel and Samson, these vows that people took upon themselves. It's rare that you have anybody does it in post-rabbinic times. There was a man who was close with the chief rabbi Abraham Isaac Cook of Palestine during the British Mandate. His name was David HaNazir, David the Nazir, the Nazarite. And there's pictures of him I've seen, with this kind of bushy hair. I always identified with that. But I think I found a passage from the Mishnah, which I think helps us understand a little bit, or might give us an inkling of what was going on here, which is just barely mentioned, by the way. Megan, could you read from the Mishnah on number 6? Megan, would you like to read? So we're at number 6, at the bottom of the second page.
6. One who vowed many days of Nazariteship while outside Eretz Israel and completed his Nazariteship and afterward came to Eretz Israel in order to bring the offerings at the end of his Nazariteship. The school of Shammai say he must be a Nazarite for 30 days, so that he has observed a term of Nazariteship in ritual purity in Eretz Israel. And the school of Hillel said he is a Nazarite from the beginning. That is, he must observe his entire Nazariteship again.
So what's in the background here is, can you do this Nazariteship outside of the land of Israel? Eretz Yisrael is the land of Israel. And there are those that said no, and many said no. And so what they said, well, if you did do it, when you come back, and then there was the two schools divided, then you have to do 30 days of that, and then you can end it. And Hillel says, no, if you, the house of Hillel, if you took a vow, you're going to do 3 years, then you start over from zero. You've got to start. So a little bit maybe in the background of the things that of this text. And now comes this anecdote which I think might be able to help us a little bit. Go ahead, Megan.
It once happened in regard to Queen Helene, 1st century CE, whose son had gone to war, and she said, if my son will return from war safely, I will be a Nazarite for 7 years. And her son returned safely from the war, and she was a Nazarite for 7 years. At the end of 7 years, she ascended to Eretz Israel, and the school of Hillel instructed her, in accordance with their opinion, that she should be a Nazarite for an additional 7 years. And at the end of those 7 years, she became ritually impure and was therefore required to observe yet another 7 years of Nazariteship, as ritual impurity negates the tally of the Nazarite. And she was found to be a Nazarite for 21 years. Rabbi Yehuda said she was a Nazarite for only 14 years and not 21.
The brilliance of the Talmudic argument. Somebody's got to have the last word. No, not 21, only 14 years. Of course, the amount of years is less important here. What I found fast, I mean, I've seen this years ago, this Mishnah, because there's an anecdote in this collection of laws, and I love those, and that happens, that's relatively rare, that the law is based on an anecdote, so to speak, or an anecdote, a historical event is added to it. Doesn't matter that if it was historical or not, but this is from the same time period, right? This is from the early 1st century. And this idea that you take a vow for certain reasons led me to fantasize, and I emphasize, I don't know this to be the simple meaning of the text, but it occurs to me that perhaps we have mention of this here, that maybe Paul took a vow to see him through this project that it was going out to do, to watch over. That's his battle, right? That's him going out to war and coming back safely. And this little detail, if for anything else, and this you do see in commentaries, just goes to show what Steve was saying beforehand, that Paul is a Jew in and a Jew out. He's a very much committed, involved Jew. So much so that he even taken a Nazarite vow, which is totally optional.
Which I think goes to Ajit's point or question that, yes, Paul is clearly, whether it's part of his own inner holiness to take that vow or to prepare, or as a resolution, or if he's politically playing this card. He does love his Jewishness, as he says in many of his letters, but he's also making it clear that, hey, I'm as good of a Jew as anybody. I just believe that Jesus is Messiah and has been raised from death, which in some ways vindicated the shame that he experienced that dashed all of our expectations. What kind of a Messiah gets crucified? That's not what we expect. And yet, as we saw in his own conversion on the Damascus road, it was really a calling more than a conversion. He comes to see that, it didn't meet my expectation, but it's a whole different approach to Torah now. It's a whole different way of being Jewish, because this Jesus, who I proclaim as Messiah, he says, he did not equate equality with God. He emptied all of his godness and became a servant, a man to approach us humbly from the bottom up, not from the top down. And so it's a reset of the expectation. And that's what he argues in these places. And he gets pushed back, but he says, look, I'm a Jew. I've got a Nazarite vow. I circumcised Timothy. I'm one of you. You're one of me. I'm just arguing for this particular situation, this particular man as Messiah. That, I think, is part of the challenge he faces.
So Don, you get bonus points for answering the Nazarite question, and you get to read this last section also because you mentioned John the Baptist as a Nazarite. Go ahead.
Are we on ministry?
24, yeah.
Okay. Now there came to Ephesus a Jew named Apollos from Alexandria, He was an eloquent man, well versed in the scriptures. He had been instructed in the way of the Lord, and he spoke with burning enthusiasm and taught accurately the things concerning Jesus, though he knew only the baptism of John. He began to speak boldly in a synagogue, but when Priscilla and Aquila heard him, they took him aside and explained the way of God to him more accurately. And when he wished to cross over to Achaia, the brothers and sisters encouraged him and wrote to the disciples to welcome him. On his arrival, he greatly helped those who through grace had become believers. For he powerfully refuted the Jews in public, showing by the scriptures that the Messiah is Jesus.
So what does it mean, do you think, the baptism of John? Or go ahead, Harold, yeah?
Oh, no, I was just going to say it's sort of a triumphalist ending of the paragraph. But, you know, I appreciate Steve's comments about Paul being a Jew, not rejecting Judaism, saying I'm one of you, etc. But I think a lot of the problem that I have in reading texts like these is because of the language. I think so oftentimes when Jews are mentioned, it's the Jews versus Paul. The Jews united to attack Paul. Paul triumphantly refuted the Jews in public. Paul the Jews, whether in conflict or whether, you know, he tried to talk to the Jews, et cetera, et cetera. And much as it may be the case that Paul identified as a Jew, you read this often enough that after a while the distinction gets lost, at least on me.
Amen.
You know, or I can certainly see that people would get the idea that, you know, that, well, the Jews were rejecting Paul, so Paul rejects the Jews and goes off to the Gentiles. And so the distinction, it's hard to keep remembering that distinction through all of these passages. Am I making any sense?
Mm-hmm. Yes. I think what Steve was trying to say perhaps is that there's the narrator of Luke Acts with one way of viewpoint, and maybe Paul himself as is reflected in the letters and is reflected in some of the information that we have here, which is not the words, it's the information, the data that it's giving us perhaps a different way of looking at it. But yes, Don.
A couple of things. I studied with a group on Saturday, and I asked the question, how can I refer to your people without portraying what Harold was saying, whether it be Jews or Hebrews or people of the book, or what can I call the people that I am studying with, because they're all Jewish. And they came back to me with the thought of using Jews as a term to describe what we were talking about was fine with them. If I am to say or to use another word, please, or another noun, please tell me. I don't mean to be offensive.
No, thank you for your sensitivity. Thank you.
The second thing I wanted to say was to get back to your question about John the Baptist and baptism. Did you ask a question, or were you going there?
No, you go ahead. I don't know necessarily.
Okay, well, there's a thought that John the Baptist was an Essene, who was part of a strict religious community that lived outside of Jerusalem, and that he had as an initiation rite a baptism of repentance, which is much different than the Christian baptism of today. Because how can an infant be repentant of a life that it just stepped into? Perhaps baptism of repentance may fit with immersion of an adult who lays his past life down and rises up to a new life. But that was a different baptism than what Jesus experienced by John.
Okay, what I appreciate about this chapter for me, I'm just going to kind of take over because we're at the end of our time, is the fact that there's one more aspect of pluralism here. Of here's a group from Alexandria. Where did Christianity or belief in Jesus in Alexandria come from? I don't think there's any other instances of this. Correct me if I'm wrong, Steve. And so, you know, in older commentaries, oh, he must have been from Philo, a student of Philo's. Well, that's because people know about Philo of Alexandria, so they must be, you know, oh, you meet a Jewish person from New York. Hey, do you know so-and-so, or from Israel? It's like, we all, you know, they all must know each other. No, I think that's a lovely thing. It's also, to me, it's a little bit funny that, you know, they say, no, well, you've got it almost right. It really got to fine tune your argument a little bit. You don't fit in. So there's this kind of conformity now and that's part of an organizational maturity, I guess, that as an organization grows, then there's less pluralism. There's more, you know, what's the right way? We have a mention here of the way of God. We had beforehand a number of times the way. And so what is meant there, the way of God, is this understanding of Jesus in the context of God, I think. But the best part, from my point of view, from the narrative, is that this section, there's no Peter, there's no Paul, there's none of the establishment guys. You know, this is like this is the next generation on their own, not necessarily generation by age, but the next layer of the generation of development of the church. They're on their own, and so I'm always looking at this. So, what is the narrator trying to tell us about how the church grew? And it's not all about Paul, right? There's this empowerment of some of the others to do things on their own. Could you agree or disagree with that, Steve?
Well, I do agree with that. And the last thing I wanted to add to that is Apollos, coming from that amazing library in Alexandria, right? I mean, it was the center of so much, a great learning. Well, anyway, Apollos becomes a faction in the Corinthian community. He goes back and as Paul writes in his first letter to Corinth, some of you say I'm with Apollos. Some of you say I'm with Peter. Some of you say I'm with Christ. Some of you say I'm with Paul. They had already dissolved into these factions within the Jewish Christian koinonia or fellowship. And so that's when Paul says, look, we've got to find a way to be pluralistic. It's not, we're one body, but we have different gifts, different parts, different perspectives, and we need each other. We need everybody. So again, I think reading Paul from the inside out more deeply helps moderate or mediate some of this black and whiteness that we're seeing in this, you know, telescopic vision of Luke Acts, which is basically trying to make the point that, again, Christianity is the legitimate heir to Judaism, and that it needs and incorporates Judaism, but that it is the bad word that becomes used and from negatively from the outside in, it supersedes. And what I want to say is, I don't think Paul had that theology. I don't think he did. And I can argue that, but here it's clearly superseding. And that's the source of lots of pain and persecution. So
these are look at our conversation today was really, really important to me. I think we've reached another generation in our development. Please tell others about this, not necessarily from the joy for them to join our group to study, but I think the fact that we're doing this, I think it's quite significant. I don't believe there are very many groups like this in the world, in the United States. I'm sure there are, but not lots of them. And so it's important that the word of this conversation, with the sensitivity of Don and the willingness to be honest of Harold, in the pain, the word gets out about this. So we're being evangelical, right? We're getting the word out there. All right, everybody. See you next week.
Thank